This is Philosophy Bites with me, Nigel Warburton.
And me, David Edmonds.
Philosophy Bites is entirely unfunded. Please help us keep it going by subscribing or donating at www.philosophybites.com.
Suppose you believe something. Say that the rich should donate a portion of their wealth to the poor. Now you might believe this because you read it in a book, or because your parents taught it to you, or you learnt it in church. Or perhaps there's an evolutionary explanation for your belief. Does it matter, we asked Amir Srinivasan, what the origins of our beliefs are?
Amir Srinivasan, welcome to Philosophy Bites.
Thank you.
We're going to focus on genealogy. Could you just say what that is?
A genealogy is a story or an account of the genesis or origins of a thing, or often a person. So as we normally use the term in everyday conversation, we mean by a genealogy someone's family ancestry, your parents, your grandparents, your great-grandparents, and so on. But the term genealogy has a special philosophical meaning that was given to it by the 19th century German philosopher Nietzsche. So in 1887, he wrote this very famous book called On the Genealogy of Morals, in which he gives an account of the origins not of a particular person or a family, but instead of an entire system of belief, which he calls Christian morality.
So it's a way of showing where something came from, basically.
But you can do different things with genealogy. So, for example, you can use a genealogical story to try and vindicate or justify something. Philosophers like Locke and Hobbes and Rousseau tried to show that their ideal political arrangements came out of the state of nature in a rational way. But Nietzsche inverts that by using genealogy to discredit or undermine Christian morality.
For Nietzsche, Christian morality turns out to have its origins in a kind of resentment turned on the individual's self.
That's absolutely right. So Nietzsche thinks that Christian morality comes out of a slave revolt, a revolt of the weak and powerless against the noble and strong aristocrats. And what the slaves do is they invent this ideology, this system of belief that allows them to take power away from the dominant class of aristocratic noblemen.
So turning the other cheek when you're a slave is about all you can do.
That's right. And if you can convince the noblemen, who were originally considered to be the good people in society, that they are actually evil, then you can come to dominate them in turn.
So Nietzsche thinks he's shown that Christian morality is not really anything special because it is just a practical solution to an awkward situation of a bunch of slaves.
Yes, but that can make it sound like a better thing than I think Nietzsche wants us to think Christian morality is, because we like solutions to awkward problems. But Nietzsche wants to suggest something much darker and much more destabilizing, that Christian morality, for all its appearance of being good and lovely and kind, actually has its deep roots in acts of violence and resentment and revenge.
What Nietzsche's done here is give a story about the origin of something. So he's purporting to undermine Christian morality by showing it came from something else.
That's absolutely right. Nietzsche's not the first person to do it, however. We actually see this kind of negative genealogical reasoning throughout the history of philosophy. So my favorite example, and it's a very early example, comes from Xenophanes of Colophon, writing at the end of the 6th century and the early 5th century BC. And so Xenophanes was a skeptic about the Greeks' beliefs about the gods. So in one fragment we have from him, he says that the Greeks all believe that the gods look like men. But if horses and cattle had hands with which to paint the gods, they would paint their gods as horses or cattle. And Xenophanes' sly suggestion here is that our beliefs about the gods and the form that they take actually comes from human narcissism. And this genealogical revelation should put some pressure on our beliefs about what the gods look like or what form they take.
But this style of reasoning isn't confined to the 19th century or Greek philosophy. As you said, it's found throughout the history of philosophy, but it's not been very popular in the 20th century amongst analytic philosophers. It's something almost that's been despised.
Right. One way of drawing a distinction, in fact, between so-called continental philosophy and so-called analytic philosophy is how these two traditions of philosophy respond to genealogy. So a lot of continental philosophers, most obviously Foucault, think that we should be attending to the historical, sociological, and so on, origins of beliefs and practices, including philosophy itself. Whereas early analytic philosophers, especially working in the first half of the 20th century, were really skeptical that there was anything of philosophical importance to be learned from the origins of things. Early analytic philosophers were very interested in science and held science up as a model of rational inquiry. But one of the things that happens when you look at how scientists actually come up with their theories is that they can often generate hypotheses for somewhat wacky reasons. So a hypothesis might come to a scientist in a dream or in a hallucination. And that seems to put some pressure on the idea that science is this perfectly rational inquiry. So one of the things that early analytic philosophers wanted to insist on was the distinction between where a hypothesis came from and whether a hypothesis was well confirmed by the evidence. So when it comes to actually deciding whether a scientific hypothesis is true or not, what we do is we test it in the lab, out in the world. The question of where it came from, why that particular scientist came up with that particular hypothesis, is just a question for psychologists or historians.
And in fact, there's this notion of the genetic fallacy, the fallacy of confusing the origin of something with what it actually is now.
Right. So let's take a specific example. So imagine your friend Dave tells you that Tashkent is the capital of Uzbekistan. And let's say it also turns out that Dave is really bad at geography, particularly capitals. The fact that your belief came from Dave and Dave is a bad geographer doesn't entail that Tashkent isn't the capital of Uzbekistan. In fact, it is. So generally, you can't infer from the origins of a belief to the truth or falsity of that belief. And if you do so, you are usually committing the genetic fallacy.
If we've established that Dave's not good at geography and then he happens to tell you something that's true, the fact that it came from Dave doesn't undermine the truth of the statement about that particular capital. Nevertheless, there's a sense in which if you can show that Dave is an unreliable source, you're up in the air. You don't really know whether it's true or false.
Great. So you've just drawn a distinction between a belief's being true or not and a belief's being justified or not. Let's go back to the Dave example. Let's say I formed the belief that Tashkent is the capital of Uzbekistan merely on the basis that Dave told me so. I have no other reason for thinking it's the case. I haven't corroborated it. I haven't looked it up in the encyclopedia. And then I find out that Dave is really terrible at geography. I think the correct answer to what I should do in that case is I should suspend belief about whether Tashkent is the capital of Uzbekistan. If I inferred from the fact that Dave was bad at geography to the conclusion that Tashkent wasn't the capital of Uzbekistan, then I would have committed the genetic fallacy. So I shouldn't conclude that the belief is false, but I should give up the belief because I've just found out that my belief comes from an unreliable source. But a small complication here is that I could have, after getting this belief originally from Dave, then gone on to corroborate it. So I might have gone to Tashkent or looked it up in an encyclopedia or answered correctly on a pub quiz that Tashkent was the capital. And then the fact that I originally got the belief from an unreliable source shouldn't undermine my belief.
Well, to take a similar style of reasoning, many evolutionary psychologists today are explaining the origins of morality and revealing things about what probably happened in the Pleistocene. And this is quite unnerving in some ways. Perhaps it shows that our moral beliefs are just really the sorts of things which small groups of early hominids evolved to believe. There's no objective morality. It's just a convenience for selective reproduction.
So I think that's really interesting. We have seen in the last few decades an explosion of genealogical reasoning in the sciences and specifically the cognitive sciences. You have a great example, the supposed evolutionary origins of our moral beliefs put forward by evolutionary psychologists, but we also have evolutionary and neurophysiological accounts of our theological beliefs or our disposition to believe in God. We have certain psychologists and philosophers trying to argue that our tendencies to have certain kinds of Kantian intuitions in response to moral cases actually lies in our neurophysiology. And you have some experimental philosophers trying to show that our very philosophical intuitions also come from these contingent origins, background features about ourselves like gender, culture, language, and so on. So there has been a real explosion of genealogical thinking in, I think, the wider intellectual culture coming from the cognitive sciences. And this has affected how philosophers in analytic philosophy are thinking about genealogy. There's a renewed attention to the kind of arguments that Nietzsche was putting forth. And so there are a lot of philosophers, a lot of ethicists who think that evolutionary considerations should prompt us to think that there is no mind-independent objective morality. This can push in one of two directions. So some ethicists think that we should give up on the existence of morality altogether. Others think we should endorse a more subjectivist understanding of morality, where the moral truths come out of our beliefs about the moral truths. So I think the question of whether, say, evolutionary psychology or evolutionary psychological explanations of our moral beliefs, if true, should undermine our moral beliefs or moral realism is incredibly vexed. For the reasons that I said before, I don't think that all such arguments simply commit the genetic fallacy. To say that is too quick. And yet, on the other hand, it is very difficult to explain just why evolutionary psychology should, in fact, undermine our moral convictions or our moral beliefs.
But if tendencies towards altruism, for instance, are simply the result of evolutionary selection of certain sorts of behaviour that tend to maximise our potential to reproduce and for our offspring to live long enough to reproduce and so on, if that's all it is, why would we have any belief beyond that altruism is a good thing? It's just something that we've evolved to feel.
Well, take your particular mathematical beliefs. If I knew enough about your upbringing and your particular mathematical history, I could give a complete genealogy of why you believe the various mathematical propositions you do. So I could give a particular story about why you believe that 2 + 2 = 4 that makes no mention of the fact that, indeed, 2 + 2 = 4. I could just tell a story about when you went to school and who taught you arithmetic and so on. So the mere fact that I can give a genealogical account of why people believe what they do doesn't show that those beliefs are false or that there aren't mind-independent facts out there that those beliefs are tracking.
Isn't there a danger, though, with this style of thinking that we'll all end up radical skeptics believing we just believe the things we do because of the histories of how we came to believe those things?
Yes, I think that is a real danger because everything we believe because of some sort of causal history or another. So if the mere fact of there being a genealogy of your belief undermines your belief, then we're going to end up having no justified beliefs whatsoever. Most philosophers think at least some of our beliefs are justified, just like most scientists seem to think that most of their, or at least some of their scientific beliefs are justified. The challenge, therefore, for the negative genealogist, the person who wants to use a particular genealogical story to debunk a belief or system of beliefs, is to give an account of why that particular genealogy has a debunking force without giving way to just radical skepticism. So people who, for example, are skeptical about morality on the basis of evolution want to say that there's something particular about the evolutionary story about our moral beliefs that undermines them.
Isn't there an implicit cutting off of an alternative explanation there? Isn't it that they just come from evolution? They don't come from any other source such as religion or something in the fabric of the universe. It's not just that you can give a plausible story, it's just that it is the only plausible story.
I think that's a really good point. If you are a theist or if you're religious, it's open to you to simply deny the evolutionary story as the complete story. You could, for example, think that God has guided evolution to ensure that humans, as a result of natural selection, will end up with approximately true moral beliefs. And there's nothing in philosophy that says that you can't have that view. In fact, if you are religious or a theist, I think that's a very good view to have.
So evolution could have come up with all kinds of solutions in terms of the kinds of moral beliefs that we have. And it's come up with this one roughly for us, that we have some kind of concerns for other people. Wouldn't it be a weird coincidence if evolution just happened to pick on something which is objectively true out there?
I think that's a very popular and persuasive form of the debunking argument. So the idea is that there are these mind-independent moral truths out there, or so the moral realist says, and yet we have this causal story, this genealogical story, according to which our moral beliefs are fixed by natural selection. And as Darwin says, we could have turned out differently. We could have become like ant people. We could have had ant morality, where we were happy to do things like sacrifice one person for the sake of the many, which we aren't generally willing to do in human morality. So isn't it a huge coincidence that we happen to get on these moral truths? Well, let's take Dave, the bad geographer, again. So Dave is a really bad geographer. Let's say he gets it wrong 99% of the time whenever he's asked a question about geography. He tells you that Tashkent is the capital of Uzbekistan. It is a huge coincidence that Dave got it right. Probably he wasn't going to get it right. Let's say you form the belief on the basis of unreliable Dave that Tashkent is the capital of Uzbekistan, and then you use the belief in the pub quiz, and you get the answer right. So you now have confirmation that the belief is true. So although it's a coincidence that Dave got it right, the fact that it's a coincidence doesn't seem to undermine your justification. And you might think that a similar answer is available to the moral realist. So the moral realist could say, yes, it is a huge coincidence that our evolutionarily determined moral beliefs approximately get on to the mind-independent moral truths. But that doesn't undermine our moral beliefs, because we know that our moral faculty, as a matter of coincidence, is reliable. How do we know this? We see on the news someone's being tortured, and we know that torture is wrong. And because we know that torture is wrong, we know, in turn, that the faculty that produced that belief is approximately reliable. It can get humans onto approximately true moral beliefs.
Is that what you believe, or are you rehearsing an argument from a position that you don't actually subscribe to?
To be very honest, I do not know what to believe about this whole mess of issues. I think on one hand, genealogy, and especially negative genealogical arguments, are incredibly psychologically effective. There's something that grips us when we find out about the origins of our moral beliefs or our religious beliefs, or really any set of beliefs. At the same time, I think it's very, very hard to give an argument that is philosophically persuasive for why we in fact ought to give up our beliefs in light of those genealogical revelations.
So in a sense, genealogy becomes a device for rhetoric, and the question is it good philosophy?
Exactly. Nietzsche was, I think, very aware of the psychological potency of genealogy, but I don't think he was at all naive about that more fundamental philosophical question about whether it constitutes good philosophy. So just a few years after he publishes The Genealogy of Morals, he writes a book called Daybreak, in which he says, the more we learn about the origins of a thing, the less significant those origins come to seem. So there's a deep ambivalence in genealogy, even for Nietzsche. And I think there is a serious question to be asked about what kind of philosophical merit might be had in genealogical reasoning. I think it's obviously the case that we cannot dismiss genealogical reasoning as merely committing the genetic fallacy. There are some cases in which learning about the genealogy of your belief obviously undermine that belief. For example, if you find out that the only reason you believe Tashkent is in Uzbekistan is because an unreliable geographer told you so, I think that clearly undermines the justification of that belief, although the belief is in fact true. But the question is, can we extend that very simple case by analogy to these far more complex questions having to do with morality and religion and so on? And I think that's the vexed philosophical question.
Amir Srinivasan, thank you very much.
Thank you.
For more Philosophy Bites, go to www.philosophybites.com. You can also find details there of Philosophy Bites books and how to support us.